Today's video is brought to you by Blinkist. Now, one question I often get asked in regards to these videos is what is the most difficult part of the entire process? And by far the most difficult part is sifting through page after page of subject matter and trying to write a script to condense those ideas to a broad audience. If you've ever tried to explain the intricacies of a book or show to someone who's never heard of it, you know what I'm talking about. And that's why I'm happy to tell you about Blinkist. Because given the fact that there are only so many hours in the day and learning more about subject matter such as health, wealth, and happiness is best spent efficiently where you can digest those core ideas. And Blinkist gives you direct access to efficient learning, with access to over 3,000 nonfiction titles, and does the difficult work of scanning through them and condensing those core ideas into 15 minutes or less, where you can either read or listen to each title and learn something new and valuable every day. One book that I recommend is Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki, as I found it to be incredibly practical advice in regards to starting to work for myself, and overall I thought it was a great primer for planning and financial literacy. And the first 100 of you that sign up can get access to this book as well as many others on Blinkist absolutely free for a week by heading to the link in the description. And should you continue on to a full membership, Blinkist has also been kind enough to provide viewers of this channel 25% off. So thank you again to Blinkist for sponsoring today's video. Now, I don't know if I've gone off the deep end lately, but I've been on a bit of a binge in regards to mysteries regarding the deep blue. Let's hope I'm not too in over my head here, but with the last video on the CAS2, I found myself researching various other mysteries regarding the sea, and given how unique some of these cases are in this format, I could quite literally turn this into a full series if you guys wanted. Just think of this video as something to get your feet wet, as I don't typically do this anthology format, but with all of that being said, let's just dive into the mysteries today. On February 5th, 1958, amidst the Cold War, a classified practice exercise was taking place with Colonel Howard Richardson, who was flying a plane from Homestead Air Force Base in Florida, whilst carrying a Mark 15 atomic bomb. After doing a routine bombing exercise and beginning their return trip back to the United States, around 2 a.m., another fighter jet involved with the test ended up colliding with the B-47 mid-air. This caused damage to the plane, and given his locale at the time, he was instructed to ditch the bomb and land at Hunter Air Force Base in Georgia. Due to the repairs on the runway at the time, it was worried that if he landed, the weapon may explode upon impact. Here on his way back, Howard Richardson managed to dispose of the bomb in a shallow area around Tybee Island off the coast of Georgia, and hereafter he would land the plane safely. But despite this sigh of relief, shortly after, the search for the atomic bomb would create a new wave of concern. While practice flights should not be carrying any kind of plutonium trigger to detonate the bomb, it is still of concern as the bomb was believed to have been dropped so close to shore, and the weapon was still carrying a large amount of conventional explosives, as well as an undisclosed amount of uranium. Shortly after, this led to a wide-scale search to no results. While the testimony from the pilot and every other further explanation of the weapon has stated that no nuclear trigger was present, and according to official Strategic Air Command documents regarding flights during this time, there should have been no nuclear trigger. On the other hand, another document that was later declassified shows congressional testimony of the Assistant Secretary of Defense, W.J. Howard, where if you actually read the document, he was requested to attest to the categorized losses of particular nuclear weapons, where he categorizes the Tybee incident as a complete bomb, including the nuclear trigger, and that it was lost in the Savannah River. This seems to be a completely different story on behalf of the Secretary of Defense. And considering the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima was 15 to 16 kilotons output of TNT, this bomb that apparently did not detonate on this day was 100 times more powerful than that. Colonel Richardson ended up getting awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross for this particular incident, because as you can imagine, had this gone differently, things could have been a hell of a lot more messy. And in regards to what happened to the bomb thereafter that, in 2001, a hydraulic survey from the Department of Energy claimed that it was likely buried under 5 to 15 feet of silt at the bottom of Wassaw Sound. But despite further efforts to search for it, as far as the official record goes, it is still a mystery. In 1968, a fishing boat by the name of El Fausto would meet a fate that to this day is far from understood. Located in Tazacorte, the fishing boat had numerous regular tasks. While obviously used for fishing, it was normal for El Fausto to transport goods like fruits, diesel, and other goods across the Canary Islands. The owner of the boat was a man by the name of Rafael Acosta, who employed a crew which consisted of two brothers, Ramon and Eliberto Hernandez, and their cousin Miguel Acosta Hernandez. It's worth mentioning that there was normally one other crew member aboard El Fausto, however, he would not be present for what was about to transpire. All of these men were in their 40s, and they all had a lengthy career as both sailors and fishermen. And where all of this came to a head was on July 20th, 1968. Towards the later part of the day, El Fausto left Tazacorte and headed to El Hierro, around 50 miles south of La Palma. This was a regular trip, and they had been carrying some cargo to be delivered at this destination. After arriving at their destination, they went about their usual duties and unloaded cargo, where sometime after that, they were approached by another man by the name of Julio Garcia, who had also been working there at El Hierro. But he had just recently gotten a call from his wife that his daughter was ill, and he wanted to make it back as soon as he possibly could to see her. Julio had explained to the men that he tried to catch another ride, but had missed the boat and thus had asked the crew at El Fausto if they would give him a ride back to Tazacorte. Julio, desperate to get home to his child, offered to pay, but the crew instead offered to take him free of charge. After gathering various supplies for the trip, they began their 7-hour trip back home. This trip was made during the night, and they were expected to arrive at 10 a.m. in the morning on July 21st. However, something happened on this routine trip back home. While the conditions included a light fog in the morning, this was not typically a problem for this experienced crew. But when they ultimately never showed up that day, the families of the men started to worry. Subsequently, Rafael, the owner of the boat, had some of his employees begin searching along the route. Believing that they must have encountered some mechanical failure, Rafael theorized that he would find the men somewhere along the path. However, after this search turned up nothing, Rafael had contacted the local authorities to explain the situation, and the next day, a broadcast had been sent out to all the ships around the area, and further search efforts were launched by air from authorities. Yet despite perfect conditions on the 22nd, the various searches, both in water and from the skies, did not lead them to the boat. And after a few days of searching, quickly the situation had escalated from a boat lost at sea to a sunken boat, as it had no reason to be anywhere else, and thus halted the search efforts. But the tides seemed to turn quickly on July 25th, as something unexpected had occurred. The Duchess, a British ship coming from South America towards the Netherlands, had spotted a small fishing boat that was seen adrift in the ocean. The boat's location was 120 miles west of La Palma, showing that they had deviated vastly from their intended route. The crew of the Duchess later checked on all of the men, and they were all there and all alive. This was quite the relief, as all of the men seemed to be in good shape, although they had been sunburned, hungry, and very dehydrated. Coming to their rescue, the crew members of the Duchess provided food, water, and other supplies, and had even gone as far as to offer a tow back to the island of La Palma. And while you might expect those men who were lost at sea to be grateful for such an offer, they had insisted that their boat not be towed home. Instead, they asked to be given extra fuel and other supplies, as they wanted to make it back to Tazacorte on their own. When they were asked about why they had gone missing in the first place, they didn't really give an answer. They were also asked if they had some issue with their vessel. They'd all replied that nothing was out of the ordinary. Shortly after, the families were contacted about this discovery, and they were elated. Thereafter, the Duchess crew agreed to their request and sent the men off with ample supplies. They were reported to have been headed back east in the correct direction. Given their locale, it was estimated that they would make it back home at around 7 p.m. that same night, where here many people from the town had eagerly awaited their return. But soon that anticipation would lead to disappointment, because once again, the men had mysteriously never made it back. Not wanting any time to go to waste, the authorities once again began their search the next morning. They established a new reference point for their search based on where the boat had been last seen, this time dispatching multiple planes as well as the various search efforts they had done before. But once again, the search yielded nothing. El Fausto was officially lost again, and things were quiet for at least a couple more months. Because on October 9th, 1968, at around 11 in the morning, An Italian merchant ship by the name of Ana de Mayo was headed to Venezuela and had spotted the boat floating off in the distance. After getting close enough to decipher its call sign, the merchant ship had indeed rediscovered El Fausto. After getting within distance to board the ship, everything had appeared to be in good condition. The crew had completely vanished, no signs of violence were seen, but they couldn't find any logs aboard the ship to try and figure out what had happened to the crew. That was until he opened the hatch of the boat. Here, a dead man was found lying on his back, looking up. The condition of the body was decaying, and he appeared to have passed away some time ago. Searching further for clues as to what happened, the crewman from the Ana de Mayo found a journal with various pages ripped out. Some of the earlier pages contained various sets of numbers, and after that, 28 pages were ripped out of the journal. And although the Ana de Mayo's crew member did not speak Spanish, he figured this final page was a goodbye note, while various other pages just seemed to be various calculations and other numbers. Shortly after, the authorities were notified of this discovery, and Ana de Mayo had agreed to tow the boat back home with various documents that they had found and turn them into authorities. But just 2 days after this, as they were towing the boat back in, the Italian vessel had later reported back that while en route, El Fausto had sunk bow first overnight. This took the body that was inside with it, and hereafter, the notebook along with the various documents that were retrieved were given back to the authorities. As it would turn out, the notebook belonged to Julio, the same man who had asked for a ride home back in El Hierro. The final pages did in fact contain a goodbye note and gave specific instructions to his wife on how to claim all the funds owed to her, as well as instructions for selling his properties, among other duties, so she would have money after his passing. The final pages indicated to not tell their son what had happened to him. But obviously the mystery here in this situation is the lacking bit of context. Given that 28 pages were ripped out of this journal, this statement could mean a number of things. Not only that, no reference to any kind of violence on the ship, and no clues as to what happened to the rest of the crew was ever found. Moreover, the question stands as well why they refused to be towed back, and a reluctance to give an explanation seems to indicate some other kind of objective. While theories have ranged far and wide on this case, including the men witnessing something they shouldn't have at sea, being involved in some kind of illegal activity, what doesn't seem to fit was the fact that these blue-collar family men, with no criminal past, didn't seemingly have any reason to randomly turn to crime. And while you might suspect some suspicious backstory from Julio, as he was the only variable for this particular trip, it's worth mentioning that it was later confirmed his daughter was indeed ill at this time. However, I find it suspicious that if he was in such a rush to get home, then why after a 3-day delay would they say that everything was fine? And while some people have suggested the effects of the sea may have caused him to act irrationally, I suppose Julio was still rational enough to write thoroughly detailed instructions regarding his passing. And while I've seen some people critique the journal as a red herring, as this particular notebook was used for business transactions as well as other to-do lists, meaning that it would not be too uncommon for pages to be ripped out. However, it's rather odd that in the final note, Julio stated not to tell her son what happened to him. This is odd because she would presumably not know either. Given how complex this case is, there's a lot of room for interpretation. Some people have theorized that some of the initial boats have lied. Some people theorize they were leaving the country. Others have theorized that the Italian boat may have learned the full details of what had happened in that journal, as they seemed to understand the end of the book, but wanted to simply spare the family the details. But that being said, there's definitely a lot of room for interpretation on this roller coaster of a story. But as it stands today, the true fate of El Fausto remains unsolved. Now, when it comes to the company DHL, many of you have probably not heard its backstory. As I'm probably guessing, the company has done their best to gloss over the details regarding their founder. DHL, as an acronym, stands for the 3 initials of the men who founded the company, where the H was the main person responsible, that being a man by the name of Larry Hillblom, a man that had some very Jeffrey Epstein-like tendencies. He set up his headquarters in the small island of Saipan, a tax haven that, while still technically a U.S. territory, did not have the reach of the IRS. Here he began using his massive amounts of wealth after his success with DHL to treat this area like his own personal playground. He owned the island's bank, he owned the island's phone company, he owned the island's cable company, he owned many of the restaurants there, as well as the newspaper there, and he served as a seat on their Supreme Court as a special judge. This was the jurisdiction of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, where he was heavily involved with lobbying, and he also became a diplomat on behalf of the CNMI to Vietnam. And when he wasn't busy working, he was busy being a gross predator. Apparently, this was a very open secret that the guy had a thing for very, very young girls. And despite his live-in girlfriend being 16 when he met her, nobody seems to have ever said anything. And not only that, Hillblom would reportedly pillage the underage girls in the local area and keep other women on his payroll in other places like Manila, where he would have them find young girls for him on his behalf. Now, with that being said, it's worth questioning what actually happened to Hillblom later on. On May 21st, 1995, Hillblom would disappear on a regular flight from Saipan to Pagan. The weather was reportedly cloudy, so they were unable to land the plane, and as a result, they had decided to turn back around. On his way back, he made a call to his girlfriend asking him to pick him up at the airport. Whatever caused the plane to go down into the ocean this point after is a complete mystery. And whatever caused this to happen, it caused it to happen very quickly, because no SOS signal was ever sent from the flight, along with no flight recorders, as this was an older plane. Hillblom was at first misidentified for the pilot and reported as dead, but as it would turn out, he was the only body that was never recovered from this plane crash. Now, assuming this plane crash did in fact do him in, this was quite interesting, as in 1993, just 2 years prior, he had survived another plane crash. The injuries were apparently so significant that it prompted him to get facial reconstructive surgery, where he was noted to look vastly different. Sometime after Hillblom's presumed death, a DHL executive was reported to have visited his residence and disposed of his computer, where he later instructed that same live-in girlfriend to hide all of his personal belongings. His house hereafter was noted to have been scrubbed clean of all DNA, with muriatic acid poured down the drains, and inside the house, not a single personal belonging of Hillblom's could be found. And this was rather convenient because soon after, more and more women began to come forward telling the truth about what they had experienced with Larry Hillblom, where many women had claimed that Larry had been the father to their child. However, with Hillblom's body never recovered, and with nobody able to get DNA from his residence, it was impossible to prove this in a court of law via a paternity test. After a long and extensive legal battle between the estate and some of the children, the judge ended up forcing some of Hillblom's relatives to take a DNA test. This led to 4 out of the 8 alleged children settling out of court for around $90 million each. Continuing on, however, what is worth considering before Larry's disappearance were the suspicious events that led up to it. In late 1993, he ended up getting audited by the Mariana Islands. Auditors had found a capital gain of around $226 million in a single transaction, as well as other various unreported income over multiple years. He was apparently facing a tax bill of around $97 million if he stayed in Saipan. Also in the early 1990s, he had begun funneling money into Vietnam, which at this time was illegal as there was a trade embargo for US citizens from the Vietnam War, where he was reported to have invested $100+ million there. Larry used his role as a diplomat to Vietnam through the CNMI to build close ties with their government. The money from these investments were meant to restore various resorts across the country, where Larry was noted to have used these hotels for his personal reasons. And later on, the US State Department had begun inquiring into his activities in Vietnam, where he reportedly told the US government to F off. And just several weeks before his disappearance, one of the main hotels that he had invested in had its grand opening. This has led to some speculation that Larry Hillblom did not pass away in that plane crash, and in fact had simply faked his death in order to move on to a second life in Vietnam. However, I must say there are a lot of unknowns to this story. For one, we have no idea how much Hillblom was actually worth. The guy was notorious for making any kind of paper trail next to impossible to find the guy, and only he fully knew the wealth of his estate. He often got frontmen to do his bidding, and to explain what I'm talking about, during the legal battle for his estate, a trail of papers had ended up leading back to one of his close friends, where his friend had been the sole owner to a corporation that held a several million-dollar apartment complex in Saipan. When this was found out, the guy had no idea and was never managing it, and ended up handing the apartment complex back to the estate. The only proof of this guy being on that plane that day comes from his live-in girlfriend, who was the same one who was later disposing of his personal belongings and hiding evidence. And that destroyed computer from the DHL exec puts even more details in the dark. The third mystery here is what time the plane actually had crashed, as the search efforts had only begun the day after. With only about a fourth of the plane ever being recovered, there's no way to know what actually caused the crash. And what I found to be incredibly puzzling regarding this guy's case is just how difficult it is to find any info on him. The only documentary on this guy has been purged from the web, And the only book detailing his life writes it under the pretenses that he's dead, because in one of the opening sections he writes, "For efficiency's sake, I must assume that Hillblom is actually dead, and not basking beneath a Southeast Asian sun somewhere, surrounded by nubile young women, pineapples, and Vietnamese coffee. As many still believe, including agents of the Internal Revenue Service and the U.S. Department of State, I must disregard the former governor of Guam, who claimed to have seen Hillblom recently on a trip to Thailand, as well as an MIA organization that may or may not possess physical proof of Hillblom living in that country. Hillblom's estate chose not to verify the latter, despite paying out nearly $200 million to law firms, of which millions have been spent chasing less credible rumors. While I will note that the remainder of Hillblom's estate was apparently around a conservative $600 million by the time all the legal processes were over, and the remainder was donated to medical research. However, that's not to say that everything was fully accounted for, as trying to figure out the full net worth of a secretive billionaire puppet master who founded a globally present company and spent the majority of his life hiding money away from the IRS is just as difficult as now finding any evidence of Hillblom at the bottom of the ocean. This is Barely Sociable. Have a good night.